Hello, I'm Jo Fay, and this is a Swissinfo podcast. Swissinfo is the multilingual and international public media company of Switzerland. Two astrophysicists from the University of Bern hope to get a little closer to unravelling the mystery of the origins of the solar system. They believe the key to this lies in the ice that can occur in a dust layer on comets. Welcome to the Swiss Connection Science Podcast. What you're hearing is a shaker table made for shaking scientific instruments. The idea is to simulate vibrations that space instruments have to undergo during a rocket launch. An instrument that will soon have to undergo such shaker tests is a spectrometer made for detecting ice on comets. It's currently being developed in Bern, Switzerland. Our science journalists, Michele Andina and Christian Raaflaub, visited the Department of Space Research and Planetary Sciences at the University of Bern earlier this year to find out what this new instrument can do. And Michele joins me in the studio today. Michele, tell me how it works.
So what's special about the spectrometer is that it uses terahertz waves. This is not actually a new technology. It's something that's used, for instance, in airports for security scans, but it's a novelty in space research. And it could help with investigating the surface of planets, moons, and in this case, the surface of comets. We asked Nicholas Thomas, who's a professor of experimental physics and one of the developers, why they're interested in comets.
I'm very interested in looking at how ices and dust have been brought together during the formation of the solar system. And by studying the surface of a comet, and at least the few centimetres below the real surface, then we've got a chance at least of being able to place some constraints on the solar system formation process.
Can you explain in a few words, in layman's terms, how that instrument you came up with works?
Well, it's rather simple and follows a standard way of performing spectroscopy. So one would normally have something like a spectrometer which looks at the individual wavelengths of light and is then able through that to identify specific spectral lines. This instrument works very much in the same way. It's just looking at a very new wavelength range which is now only accessible due to new technologies. So the way in which the instrument works is that we have a transmitter which is fed via a laser, okay, and it produces then terahertz waves. These waves are emitted by the transmitter, and then the terahertz is then reflected or absorbed by the surface that's under study, and the terahertz that's reflected is picked up by a receiver. And then this goes into a spectrometer which splits all of the photons into the different wavelengths and constructs a spectrum from it.
And it's from that spectrum that scientists can tell what the comet's surface layer is made of. What makes this terahertz device unique, so Nicholas tells us, is the way it manages to diagnose water and ice.
In cometary surfaces and cometary subsurfaces, we are somewhat uncertain about the relationship between crystalline and amorphous ice. So when ice reaches a certain temperature, it becomes crystalline and forms the crystals that we know about from snow and so on. But at very low temperatures, ice can be amorphous, not have this crystalline structure. And this technique at terahertz wavelengths is capable of distinguishing between amorphous and crystalline ice in situ.
And finally, maybe finding signs of life in this ice?
I don't know that we are able to do that. That's actually one of the reasons why we're testing things right now. We're quite interested in seeing whether there are organics, whether it is diagnostic for organics in this wavelength range, And it's one of the things that we need to experiment with in the lab before we go to build a flight instrument.
In the laboratory, the scientists have set up a test plant inside a vacuum chamber that measures around 1 cubic meter. Linus Stöckli, an astrophysics doctoral student and co-developer of the spectrometer, explains to us what they can do here.
In this chamber, we simulate the conditions that we find on comets, which means very cold and a vacuum. So inside here we have the setup that we actually would then be sending to space at some point. So inside here we have our sample holder.
The sample holder is a small round metal frame, maybe the size of a saucer, with a transparent bottom.
So we put in ice and we can mix it with dust. So we can have different compositions. We can have like layers, we can have large ice clumps and a bit of dust. We can have just ice and then sprinkle a bit of dust on top. And we do have antennas that we can put inside the vacuum chamber to actually scan the sample. We basically shine this terahertz light either through a sample, so we have the transmission mode, or we rotate the antennas, and then we can do reflection mode spectroscopy, so we can scan the surface. And currently we don't know how we will do it on the comet when we get there, because this is just a prototype, so we test basically all the possibilities that we have to implement this instrument. And on a comet, there we hope that we will be able to do reflectance mode because it's much easier. The transmission mode would be harder to do in situ on a comet. But the basic operation principle is the same. We have these two antennas that we scan across the surface to get an image pixel by pixel of the surface of the comet. And from that we hope to determine the composition on the surface and also on a subsurface level of the comet's nucleus. In principle, this instrument can also be adapted, so to do measurements anywhere where there is ice. So possibly even Mars on the polar caps, or maybe somewhere else. But the main focus now, for me at least, is comets.
It's one thing to make the instrument work in a vacuum chamber on Earth, but bringing it all up to space and getting it to work there is a challenge of its own. Here's Nicholas again.
We're sort of imagining that we are able to put a transmitter and a receiver down a borehole, and then using lines, potentially fiber optic cables or some form of cables, bringing them up to the spectrometer that's sitting on the lander. When we design a flight instrument, we also have to make sure that it's going to withstand the environment that it sees. And that's not merely the environment that it sees at, for example, the cometary surface. It's also the environment that it sees getting to that cometary surface. And that means being launched, going into vacuum, experiencing the shock when the spacecraft separates from the rocket, experiencing radiation, so highly energetic particles that can damage the instrument and damage the electronics. All of those things need to be tested. So we put the devices on a shaker table, we put them inside a thermal vacuum chamber to simulate vacuum, but also to simulate the temperature range that the instrument can experience, and that can be extreme. And finally, we also perform radiation testing. And so there are things like this that where we have to perform this rows of tests, and that can take several years. And so when we're building the flight instrument, we will have prototypes that have to undergo that type of testing.
So this instrument won't land on a comet anytime soon. We asked Linus when he expects his project to lift off.
The way it works is ESA has openings for slots for instruments for different missions.
ESA, that's the European Space Agency, of which Switzerland is a member state.
And universities can apply for that. Currently there's no mission planned, but since we are doing prototyping, we wouldn't be ready anyways to deliver now. So what we do is we're in close contact with ESA. They also funded the initial stage of the project. So when there's going to be a next opening for a mission to a comet, we will definitely apply. And from then on, also continue with a closer collaboration with other companies to actually get the space hardware ready.
Should ESA select the project in their next call, so Nicholas tells us, a launch can hardly be expected before the early 2040s.
How do you, as an astrophysicist, live with the time factor? I mean, your equipment may not be used in decades to come.
Yeah, it's quite hard. This is a very hard element to the whole thing, you know, that you might be working on something that you'll never see yourself. You'll never see the data from those things. And you know, I'm also myself coming close to retirement. But if you think about it in those terms about, you know, if you think about it in a rather selfish way that, well, I won't see it, so I'm not going to do any more work on this, then this is a very selfish way, and it's not actually the way in which science should be done and actually is done. A lot of us are preparing for the future, even though we won't see it. I think we all, those of us that do that, I think we still get a kick out of it because it's the younger generation that will take this on. And hopefully they might sort of remember when they get their data that, oh, you remember that character that started, you know, that sort of had those first thoughts about that? What the hell was his name? Oh, Thomas. Yeah, I remember him. And maybe that will come across at some point. And that's enough for me.
Thank you, Christian and Michele. If you like this episode, do leave us a 5-star review. That'll help others to find our podcast. And make sure to join us again next week when we're talking to students who, in their spare time, are building rockets that can return to Earth after having dropped off their payload in space. Today's episode was recorded and edited by our science and video journalist Michele Andina. For more content, visit our website swissinfo.ch. I'm Jo Fay. Thanks for listening.
Hello, I'm Imogen Folks from Swiss Info's Inside Geneva podcast. On February 24th, 2022, Russia attacked Ukraine. The invasion caused Europe's largest refugee crisis since World War II, and during the year-long conflict, tens of thousands, possibly hundreds of thousands of people, soldiers and civilians, have been killed. Over the past year, a number of episodes of Inside Geneva have looked at the heavy humanitarian toll of the war and its wider implications for the world. We've been joined by historians and international human rights experts to ask about the background to the invasion. We've talked to major UN aid agencies about how the war in Ukraine is impacting other humanitarian crises. And we've asked if sanctions or war crimes investigations can stop or at least limit this conflict. If you're particularly concerned by the war in Ukraine, do listen to these episodes. You can find Inside Geneva free to listen on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google, and all your usual podcast apps.